The air in the throne hall of the obsidian spire was as cold as the king's heart. It clung to the marble floors and crept up the tapestries depicting the glorious, blood-soaked history of his line. Zara felt it seep through the thin fabric of her dress, a humble garment of grey wool that marked her as nothing and no one. She stood alone in the vast, echoing space, a petitioner before a god. And this god, with his silver eyes and face carved from unforgiving stone, was about to shatter her world. Dante sat upon the throne of sharpened obsidian, a crown of twisted, frozen iron resting on his black hair. He was Vampire King, ruler of the Night Court, and the other half of her soul. She could feel the bond between them, a living, breathing thing that hummed with a silver light only they could perceive. It had snapped into place the first time their eyes met 3 months ago, a shock, a revelation, a promise of a forever she had never dared to dream of. He was king, she a Stablehand's daughter, yet the ancient magic of their people had declared them equals, had declared them one. For 3 months, that had been enough. They had met in secret, in the shadowed gardens and forgotten libraries of the palace. He had touched her face with a reverence she'd never known, his voice, usually a command that could quell armies, softening to a murmur meant only for her. He had spoken of a future, of changing the old ways, of a love that could bridge the chasm between their stations. Zara, who had owned nothing in her life, had believed him. She had given him everything. Now, he would not meet her eyes. His gaze was fixed on the high council elders flanking his throne, their faces grim and satisfied. The scent of ozone and bitter herbs, the components of the severing ritual, filled the hall. Zara of the Low Quarter, Dante's voice boomed, stripped of all its former tenderness. It was the king's voice, a weapon of ice and steel. You have been brought before this court to bear witness to a decree. The fated mate bond, recognized between yourself and I, is a complication the kingdom cannot afford. The line of succession demands purity. It demands strength. It demands a noble queen who can secure alliances and bear a true heir. Each word was a physical blow. A complication. Not a miracle, not a blessing, but an inconvenience to be disposed of. Zara wrapped her arms around her middle, a purely instinctual gesture. A cold dread, far deeper than the hall's chill, was beginning to bloom in her stomach. I will wed the Lady Serafina of House Valerus, he continued, his voice relentless. The union will strengthen our borders and our bloodline. Therefore, the bond between us must be unmade. A collective, satisfied sigh rippled through the assembled nobles. They had won. Their ancient prejudices, their obsession with blood purity, had triumphed over the magic that was the very foundation of their race. Zara finally lifted her head, her gaze locking with his. For a flicker of a second, she saw it, not the king, but Dante. A flash of agony, a silent scream of regret in the silver depths of his eyes before the mask of command slammed back into place. He was breaking himself as surely as he was breaking her. But it was his choice. He had chosen this. The high priest stepped forward, a gnarled, ancient vampire with skin like dried parchment. He carried a silver bowl and an obsidian knife. The ritual is simple, but absolute, the priest intoned, his voice a dry rustle. A cut, a drop of blood from each, an oath of renunciation. The magic will be unbound. You will be as strangers. As strangers. The thought was an absurdity. How could she be a stranger to the man whose heartbeat she could feel even from across this cavernous room? Whose thoughts sometimes brushed against her own in the quiet of the night? She didn't fight. She didn't scream or beg. Dignity was the only thing she had left to her name. She walked forward, her steps steady on the cold floor, and stood before the throne. She held out her hand, palm up. The priest took it, his touch dry and cold. The obsidian knife was surprisingly sharp, a line of fire across her skin. A single drop of her blood, startlingly red against her pale flesh, welled up. Dante descended from the throne. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his presence sucking all the warmth from the air around him. He did not look at her as he offered his own hand to the priest. The knife flashed again. His blood, when it came, was the same color as hers. A part of her, the foolish, hopeful part, had half expected it to be silver. The priest let their blood drop into the bowl, where the herbs hissed and smoked. Speak the words, my king." Dante's eyes, silver and remote, finally met hers. The bond between them flared, a desperate, silent plea. "Don't do this. Don't make me do this." But his face was a mask. His voice, when he spoke, was the tolling of a funeral bell. "I, Dante of the royal house of Noctis, king of the eternal night, do hereby renounce the bond of fated mate with the woman Zara. I cast it aside. I declare it void. I choose my kingdom. I choose my duty." He paused, and the silence stretched, thin and fragile. He drew a breath that seemed to tear at his lungs. "I choose my bride, the Lady Serafina. Let the old magic be undone." The words settled into the space between them, killing the silver light, strangling the hum of connection. Zara felt a tearing sensation deep inside her soul, a physical wrenching so profound she gasped, staggering back a step. It felt like a limb being ripped from her body. The world grayed at the edges. Through the haze of her pain, she saw his jaw clench, a single muscle twitching in his cheek. He felt it too. Of course he did. This pain was shared, even in its ending. "And you, girl," the priest prompted, turning to her. "Your renunciation." Zara looked at Dante, at the king on the throne of bones and duty. She saw the cost of his crown, the price of his power. And in that moment, something inside her hardened into a core of pure, unyielding ice. He had made his choice. Now, she would make hers. She thought of the secret she held, a tiny flicker of life nestled beneath her heart. A secret she had come here to share with him tonight, her heart full of nervous joy. A secret that was now her salvation and her curse. This ritual, they believed, would sever all ties. But it was designed for a bond between two. It had no power over three. She would not renounce the bond. Not really. She would renounce him. "I, Zara," she said, her voice small but clear in the sudden stillness. It did not tremble. "I accept your choice." She looked directly into Dante's eyes, letting him see the vast, empty space where her love had been. "You have chosen your kingdom. You have chosen your duty. In doing so, you have surrendered all rights, all claims, all connection to me and to anything that is mine. I hold you to your renunciation. Let us be as strangers." She did not use the formal words. She did not need to. Her meaning was absolute. She turned, before the priest could protest, before the king could command her to stay, and walked away. She did not run. She walked with the measured tread of a queen leaving a conquered territory, her head held high. With every step, she felt the bond withering, not vanishing, but going dormant, a severed nerve that would ache for a lifetime. She did not look back. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical weight, but she did not look back. She walked out of the throne hall, out of the palace, and out of his life, carrying their son into the wilderness of the world alone. 10 years. A decade can pass like a single breath or an eternity. For Dante, it had been an eternity of breaths, each one shallower than the last. He sat on the same obsidian throne, the iron crown heavier now, its cold a permanent fixture against his skin. The kingdom was stable, the borders secure. His marriage to Serafina was a monument to political expediency, a cold, sterile alliance that had produced no air, no warmth, and no joy. The fated mate bond, the one he had publicly severed, had left a phantom limb in his soul. It ached on cold nights, a dull, persistent throb that reminded him of all he had sacrificed for a crown that brought him no comfort. Serafina had grown bitter, her beauty curdling with her disappointment. The lack of a child was a public humiliation for them both, a constant whisper in the court. In the last few years, she had taken to finding comfort in other beds, a poorly kept secret he chose to ignore. Her infidelities were a symptom of the disease at the heart of their marriage, of his reign. His line, which had ruled for 1,000 years, was dying. The irony was so bitter it was almost comical. He had given up his soul for a pure-blooded heir, and the gods had given him nothing. Tonight was the annual Blood Moon Gala, a tedious affair of posturing and veiled threats disguised as diplomacy. Dante surveyed the crowded ballroom from his dais, his silver eyes missing nothing. The laughter sounded hollow, the music thin. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if watching a play for which he had long forgotten his lines. And then, the world stopped. The herald's voice cut through the din announcing the Lady Zara of House Crepus, from the free city of Argentis. Dante's head snapped toward the grand entrance. The name was a ghost, a whisper from a buried life. But the woman who entered was no ghost. She was a fire given form. The grey wool of her past was gone, replaced by a gown of crimson silk that clung to her figure and shimmered like liquid flame. Her dark hair, once worn in a simple braid, was now an elegant cascade of curls pinned with silver. Jewels glittered at her throat and wrists, but they were pale imitations of the light in her eyes. They were the same eyes, deep and dark, but the youthful hope was gone, replaced by a formidable, unshakable strength. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was powerful. Her bearing spoke of wealth, of command, of a life lived on her own terms. A low murmur swept through the court. House Crepus. No one had ever heard of it. The free city of Argentis was a merchant stronghold, a place where bloodlines meant less than gold. Dante's court, for all its ancient power, was suddenly faced with a force it did not understand. But it wasn't her grand entrance that stole the breath from Dante's lungs. It was the small hand she held in hers. A boy walked beside her, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. He had her dark hair, but his face was a miniature echo of Dante's own ancestors, a study in the stark, proud lines of the Noctis dynasty. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his eyes, dark like his mother's, taking in the spectacle of the court with a calm, intelligent curiosity. He was dressed in a finely tailored jacket of black velvet, and as he moved, the cuff of his left sleeve slid back just enough. Dante's heart, a muscle that had beat with monotonous duty for a decade, stopped cold. There, on the back of the boy's hand, was a mark he knew as well as his own reflection. A delicate, intricate whirl of silver, like a dusting of moonlight on the skin. The bloodline mark of the Noctis kings. It was a genetic signature so rare it appeared only in the direct royal line, a visible manifestation of their unique magic. Dante had one. His father had one. And this child, this impossible child, had one too. The room, the music, the people, it all faded into a roaring silence in Dante's ears. The phantom ache in his soul erupted into searing, agonizing pain. The ritual. The severing. It was meant to be absolute. It was meant to erase every connection. But there was only one way a child could bear that mark. Only one way the magic could have been so deeply intertwined that a ritual of unmaking could fail. She had already been pregnant. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face. 10 years. For 10 years, she had hidden his son from him. His heir. The heir he had sacrificed everything for, the heir he had been told he could never have with her, had existed all along. Zara's eyes, cool and distant, swept across the ballroom and, for a brief, calculated moment, met his. There was no fear in her gaze. No lingering affection. There was only the cool, hard glitter of a diamond forged under immense pressure. Her look was a challenge, a statement. Here I am. Here he is. What will you do now, King of Ashes? He rose from his throne, the movement so abrupt that a collective gasp went through the room. Serafina, beside him, placed a warning hand on his arm, her nails digging in. Dante, what is it? Who is that woman? He didn't hear her. He couldn't hear anything but the frantic, desperate hammering of his own dead heart. He had a son. A son. The words were both a prayer and a curse. He had a son, and the woman he had shattered, the woman he had cast out into the cold, had raised him in a world without him. The fury that began to build in his chest was a volcanic force, hot and choking. It was a rage born of a decade of loss, of emptiness, of a grief he hadn't even known he was carrying. And it was all directed at her. The antechamber was silent save for the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The heavy velvet curtains muffled the sounds of the gala, creating an insular world for the confrontation Dante had demanded. He had sent his royal guard to escort her, a command, not an invitation. She had come without protest, her composure an infuriating shield against the storm raging within him. The boy, Elias, had been left with a severe-looking governess, his small face betraying a flicker of concern before his mother had given him a reassuring nod. Now, they were alone. Dante paced before the fire, the movement of a caged wolf. The regal calm he had maintained for a decade had shattered, leaving behind the raw, incandescent fury of a man betrayed. 10 years, he finally bit out, whirling to face her. The words were gravel in his throat. You hid him for 10 years. Zara stood near the door, as if to remind them both that she could leave at any time. She had not taken the seat he gestured to. She remained standing, a pillar of crimson and ice. He has a name, she said, her voice perfectly level, infuriatingly calm. His name is Elias. His name is my son. Dante roared, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. My heir. You had no right to keep him from me. To deny him his birthright, to deny me my own child. Birthright. A single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow rose. A flicker of something, contempt, perhaps, crossed her face. What birthright did you imagine for a low-born bastard, Your Majesty? A life in the shadows, acknowledged in whispers but never in truth. Or would you have had him raised in the stables, like my father, while you and your pure-blooded queen graced the throne? Her words were sharp, precise, each one finding a chink in the armor of his rage. He flinched. He had no answer for that, because in his heart, he knew she was right. 10 years ago, he would have done exactly that. He would have hidden the child, provided for him, but never acknowledged him. He would have sacrificed the boy's happiness for the kingdom's stability, just as he had sacrificed her. The ritual failed, he ground out, seizing on the one piece of this he could understand. It should have severed everything. It only failed because you were already with child. You knew. You knew that night, in the throne hall. You knew and you said nothing. I knew that I was carrying a life, she corrected, her voice dropping, taking on a dangerous edge. A life that you, in your infinite wisdom, had just declared a complication the kingdom cannot afford. What was I to do, Dante? Plead. Beg you to accept the child of a woman you had just publicly cast aside? Should I have handed him over to you and your new bride to be raised as a political tool or a shameful secret? She took a step toward him, and for the first time, he saw the fire beneath the ice. I did what I had to do to protect my son. I left. I made a life for us, a world where he would not be judged by the name of a father who did not want him, but by the strength of his own character. I found a husband, a good man who loved Elias as his own and gave us his name and his protection. A man who is dead now, and whose fortune has given me the power to stand here before you not as a petitioner, but as an equal. The mention of another man, a husband, sent a fresh, irrational spike of jealousy through him. It was absurd. He had no right. He had a wife of his own. But the thought of her in another man's arms, of his son calling another man father, was a torment. You speak of rights, she continued, her voice a silken lash. Let us speak of rights. On the day you stood before your court and renounced our bond, you spoke your choice aloud for all to hear. I choose my kingdom. I choose my duty. You made your decision, Dante. You surrendered any and all claim to me. You cannot choose duty over love and then, 10 years later, demand the fruits of a love you abandoned. Her gaze was unwavering, her conviction absolute. You have no rights here. You gave them all away. The truth of her words hit him with the force of a physical blow, extinguishing the fire of his rage and leaving only the cold, grey ash of regret. She was right. He had done this. Every empty year, every lonely night, every pang of loss, it was all the result of a choice he had made. He had chosen the crown over the woman, politics over his own soul. And he had lost. He had lost it all. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the girl he had let go, but the queen she had become in his absence. She had built her own kingdom, a kingdom for two, and he was the stranger at its gates. The fury drained out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. What do you want? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was a surrender. Why come back now? I want nothing from you, she said, and he knew it was the truth. But my son is curious about the world of his blood father. He is old enough to understand, and it is his right to see the court he is descended from. I came back for him. So he could see what you chose over us. The words were not meant to be cruel, they were a simple statement of fact, which was somehow infinitely crueler. She turned to leave. "Zara, wait," he said, his voice raw. She paused at the door, her back to him. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I have regretted it every day for 10 years." The words were inadequate, pathetic. They could not bridge the chasm of a decade's worth of pain. So he said nothing. He just watched her go, the crimson of her dress a splash of vibrant life in his grey, silent world. He had a son. And he had absolutely no idea how to be his father. The rage did not return. In its place settled a profound and aching clarity. Zara was right. He had forfeited his rights. Demands, threats, the power of his crown all were useless against the quiet strength of her conviction. To force the issue, to drag his son into a public battle for custody, would only prove her point, that he was a tyrant who saw his child as a possession, a means to an end. It would traumatize Elias and drive Zara further away, perhaps forever. He would win the battle and lose the war for his son's soul. So he did the one thing no one, least of all Zara, expected. He did nothing. Publicly, at least. He made no claim. He did not summon her again. When the whispers of the court grew loud, speculating on the boy's uncanny resemblance to the royal line, Dante issued a quiet but firm decree that the Lady Zara and her son were guests of the crown and were to be treated with the utmost respect. The order, coming from the king himself, quelled the gossip and granted Zara a shield of royal protection. She had built her own fortress of wealth, he would reinforce it with his power. From the shadows, he began to act. He had his spymaster, an ancient vampire named Lucian whose loyalty was absolute, conduct a discreet investigation. The report confirmed what Zara had said. She had married a wealthy merchant from Argentis, a kind, older man who had adored Elias. He had died of a wasting sickness 2 years prior, leaving Zara and the boy his entire fortune. They lived in a well-appointed manor at the edge of the capital city, and they wanted for nothing. Dante began to watch. It was a new kind of power for him, the power of observation without action. He would sometimes stand on a high balcony of the spire, using his preternatural sight to watch the gardens of her manor. He saw Elias learning to ride a pony, his small face a mask of concentration. He saw him fall, and he saw Zara rush to him, not to coddle, but to check for scrapes and then encourage him to get back on, her voice carrying faintly on the wind. He saw them reading together on a bench in the sun, Elias's head resting on her shoulder. He saw a life of warmth, of gentle discipline, of unwavering love. A life he had no part in. The ache in his chest became a constant companion. It was the pain of a ghost watching the world he was meant to inhabit. He saw the gaps he could fill, the pony was old and slow, the boy's sword-fighting tutor was competent but uninspired. He saw the dangers he could mitigate, the manor's security was adequate for a merchant's widow, but not for the mother of the king's only son. He started to move, not as a king, but as a phantom benefactor. A new pony, a spirited black mare, was delivered to the manor, a gift from an anonymous admirer of the late Lord Crepus's business acumen. A new tutor arrived, a retired master-at-arms from the royal guard, with a letter of recommendation from a guild in Argentis that Lucian had forged. Dante had his own elite guard, the Shadow Cloaks, patrol the perimeter of her estate, invisible to all but him. They reported back daily. The boy had mastered a new riding trick, he had asked his mother why the sky was blue, he had scraped his knee climbing an oak tree. These small, mundane details became the center of Dante's world. He learned his son's favorite color was green. He learned he was fascinated by cartography and had a talent for drawing. He learned he had his mother's quiet determination and, Dante admitted with a pang of pride, a sliver of his own stubbornness. Zara must have known. She was too intelligent not to suspect the source of these convenient windfalls. A woman who had built a life from nothing would not believe in such rampant good fortune. But she said nothing. She accepted the gifts, utilized the tutors, and lived within the invisible circle of his protection without acknowledgement. It was a silent, unspoken truce. He would not demand, she would not refuse. He was allowed to be a provider, but not a father. A guardian, but not a presence. The first year passed in this strange, distant dance. He saw Elias grow taller, his features sharpening, the echo of Dante's own face becoming more pronounced. The urge to simply go to him, to speak to him, was a physical torment. But he held back. Patience was a lesson he had never needed to learn as king. He was learning it now, in the long, quiet hours of his self-imposed exile. He was learning to earn what he had once believed was his by right. And he was learning that the distance was a punishment of his own making, a penance he had to serve. He had chosen to be a stranger, and now he had to learn the slow, painful process of becoming something more. The second year of his silent vigil began with the first thaw of spring. The distance was no longer bearable. Watching from afar had taught him about his son, but it had also carved out a hollow space inside him that grew larger with each passing day. He needed more. He needed to hear his son's voice directed at him, to see his eyes up close. He needed to exist in the same space, to breathe the same air. He resolved to orchestrate a meeting, something that felt like chance. The royal menagerie, a sprawling park filled with creatures both mundane and magical, was a favorite place for the children of the nobility. Lucian informed him that Zara took Elias there every week, on the same day, at the same hour. It was a risk. A direct approach, even one disguised as coincidence, could shatter their fragile, unspoken truce. She could retreat, take Elias, and vanish back to Argentis, and this time he knew he would have no strength to stop her. But the risk of inaction had become greater than the risk of action. He went alone, dressed not as the king but as a simple nobleman in a dark, unadorned tunic and trousers. He left his crown and his guards behind, wanting to appear as just another man enjoying the day. He found them near the griffin enclosure. The majestic beasts were sunning themselves on the warm rocks, their leonine bodies relaxed, their eagle heads held high. Elias was sketching them in a leather-bound book, his tongue stuck out from the corner of his mouth in concentration. Zara sat on a nearby bench, watching him with a soft, unguarded expression that made Dante's heart ache. He approached slowly, his steps measured, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't for a decade. "They are magnificent creatures, are they not?" he said, his voice quiet, directed at Elias. The boy looked up, startled. His dark eyes widened slightly as he took in Dante. There was no fear, only a flicker of intense curiosity. Zara was on her feet in an instant, her body instinctively positioning itself slightly in front of her son. Her face was a mask of cool neutrality, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "They are," Elias replied, his voice clear and steady. He looked from Dante to the griffins and back again. "Their forelegs are avian, but their hind legs are feline. It seems like it shouldn't work, but it does." Dante smiled, a genuine, unpracticed expression. An astute observation. "The magic that binds them is older than the mountains. It holds a balance between sky and earth." He gestured to the sketchbook. "You have a remarkable talent. You've captured the line of the wing perfectly." A faint blush touched Elias's cheeks. "Thank you, my lord." He glanced at his mother, a silent question in his eyes. "Elias, we should be going," Zara said, her tone polite but firm. It was a dismissal. "Of course," Dante said, his smile not faltering. He did not want to push, not on this first, fragile encounter. But he couldn't leave without giving them something. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, smooth stone. It was a lodestone, naturally magnetic, humming with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. "A small gift, for a fellow artist," he said, offering it to Elias. "From the deepest caves beneath the spire. They say if you hold it while you draw, it helps guide your hand toward the true north of your subject." Elias looked at the stone, then at his mother. Her expression was unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of 10 years of unspoken history. Dante held his breath. This was the moment. She could refuse, could pull her son away and end this before it began. Then, slowly, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Elias's face broke into a brilliant smile. He reached out and took the stone, his small fingers brushing against Dante's. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection so powerful Dante almost flinched. "Thank you," the boy breathed, his eyes shining as he examined the stone. "You are most welcome, Elias," Dante said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He met Zara's eyes over their son's head. He tried to convey everything he couldn't say. Thank you. This means everything. I will not betray this trust. She simply held his gaze, her expression still guarded, but the hard, defensive line of her mouth had softened, just slightly. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a beginning. It was a door, cracked open just enough for a sliver of light to get through. He gave them a small, formal bow and walked away, the phantom sensation of his son's touch burning on his skin, a spark of impossible hope kindled in the desolate landscape of his heart. The delicate truce held. Their encounters in the menagerie became a weekly ritual, a silent appointment. Dante would appear, and Zara would permit him to stay. The conversations were always light, centered on Elias, his drawings, his studies, the magical creatures around them. Dante learned to speak a new language, one devoid of command or expectation. He learned to ask questions and truly listen to the answers. He spoke of history, of magic, of the world beyond the capital, sharing his knowledge not as a king bestowing wisdom, but as one person sharing a passion with another. Elias, for his part, was a bridge. His youthful innocence and open curiosity spanned the chasm of bitterness between his parents. He was cautious at first, but soon grew to anticipate the appearances of the quiet, knowledgeable lord who treated him not as a child, but as an intellectual equal. He would save his best drawings to show him, would come armed with questions about dragon lore or the migratory patterns of hippogriffs. Zara remained a watchful, silent presence. She rarely joined the conversations, content to observe from her bench. But Dante noticed the small changes. The tension in her shoulders would ease a little sooner each time he arrived. The cool mask of neutrality would occasionally slip, revealing a flicker of amusement when Elias said something particularly clever, or a hint of warmth when Dante praised their son's insight. She was testing him, he knew. Watching to see if he would overstep, if his patience was a performance. He was determined not to fail. The illusion of their peaceful coexistence was shattered on a sweltering midsummer afternoon. The Queen was hosting her annual garden party, a lavish affair that Zara and Elias, due to their status as protected guests of the crown, were obliged to attend. Dante was there, of course, playing his part as the distant, dutiful king, his eyes rarely leaving his son. Elias, unaccustomed to the stifling formality of court events, was flushed and thirsty. Zara led him to a refreshments table laden with pitchers of iced lemonade. As a servant poured a cup for the boy, Dante saw it. A flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. It was one of Serafina's ladies-in-waiting, a woman known for her slavish devotion to the Queen. She had been standing near the table, and as the servant turned, she made a small, almost invisible gesture over the pitcher, a fine, dark powder falling from a vial clutched in her palm. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. The world narrowed to that single, deadly moment. The powder was wolfsbane, he knew it instantly. Not fatal to a full-grown vampire, but to a child of Elias's age and hybrid nature, it would be agonizingly toxic, a poison that would burn through him from the inside out. Elias reached for the cup. Zara, her back to the lady-in-waiting, smiled at her son. Dante moved. He did not think. He reacted. He crossed the 20 feet of lawn between them in a silent, impossible blur of speed, a shadow detaching itself from the throne. He reached the table just as Elias's fingers were about to close around the glass. He swept it from the boy's grasp, the momentum carrying his arm back, and he hurled the cup against the stone wall of the garden, where it shattered, the pale liquid splashing like a weeping wound. A collective gasp went through the party. All eyes turned to him. Elias stared, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. Zara spun around, her face a storm of alarm and anger. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded. Dante ignored her. He ignored everyone. His silver eyes, now blazing with a cold, lethal fury he had not unleashed in years, were locked on the lady-in-waiting. The woman had gone deathly pale, the tiny vial still clutched in her trembling hand. "Guards!" Dante's voice was not a shout. It was a low, guttural command that cut through the sudden silence like a blade. "Seize her." Two of his shadow cloaks materialized from the crowd, their movements swift and silent. They flanked the woman, their grip on her arms like iron. Serafina rushed forward, her face a mask of practiced outrage. Dante, what is the meaning of this? You are making a scene. Lady Annalise has done nothing. Has she? Dante's gaze shifted to his wife. The cold fury in his eyes made her flinch back. He walked slowly toward her, his presence a palpable wave of menace that made the surrounding nobles shrink away. He stopped directly in front of her, so close he could see the flicker of panic in her eyes. You have tolerated the presence of this boy, this inconvenience, for 2 years, he said, his voice a deadly murmur meant only for her. But his continued existence has become a threat to you, hasn't it? As long as he lives, he is a reminder of my failure, and a potential claimant to a throne you could never give me an heir for. He reached out and plucked the vial from the trembling hand of the captured lady-in-waiting. He uncorked it and held it under Serafina's nose. Her eyes widened in genuine terror. You would have murdered a child, my child, to secure your position, he stated. It was not a question. You would have poisoned my son. He turned to face the stunned, silent court. He saw Zara, her hand protectively on Elias's shoulder, her face pale with dawning horror as she understood what had almost happened. Their eyes met, and in that shared moment of terror and fury, the last 2 years of careful distance evaporated. They were no longer a king and his former lover. They were a mother and a father, united in the primal, ferocious need to protect their child. That single, shared look decided everything. The kingdom, the crown, the cold duty he had served for a decade, it all turned to dust. There was only one thing that mattered. He turned back to the crowd, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of a king about to remake his world. This charade is over. The throne hall was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Every noble of consequence was present, summoned by a royal decree that had allowed for no excuses. They stood in anxious, whispering clusters, their eyes darting between the empty obsidian throne and the king who stood before it. Dante was not dressed in his ceremonial robes, but in the severe black uniform of his guard. He looked not like a monarch, but a soldier, an executioner. Serafina stood under guard to one side, her face pale and pinched. Lady Annalise, her accomplice, was nowhere to be seen. Her fate had already been decided in the dungeons below. Zara and Elias stood near the entrance, flanked by 2 of Dante's personal shadow cloaks. Zara's face was composed, but her hand rested firmly on Elias's shoulder, a silent gesture of protection. The boy himself was quiet, his dark eyes wide as he took in the solemnity of the occasion. He understood that something monumental was happening. Dante waited for the silence to become absolute, for the weight of it to press down on every person in the room. Then he spoke, his voice clear and cold, amplified by the hall's unforgiving acoustics. For 10 years, I have ruled this kingdom. I have upheld its laws, defended its borders, and honored its traditions. The most sacred of those traditions is the purity of the royal bloodline, the solemn duty of a king to produce a true-born heir to continue the dynasty. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. His silver gaze swept across the faces of the High Council, the old men who had advised him to cast Zara aside all those years ago. In the service of that duty, he continued, I made a choice. I renounced a fated mate bond, a gift from the magic that is our very source, and entered into a political marriage with Lady Serafina of House Valerus. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Serafina. She flinched as if struck. That marriage has been barren. That duty has gone unfulfilled. But the gods, in their infinite and cruel wisdom, saw fit to give me an heir anyway. His gaze moved to find Elias. The boy stood a little straighter under the weight of the king's attention. This boy, Elias, is my son. My firstborn and my only child. His blood is my blood. He bears the silver mark of the Noctis kings. A shocked murmur rippled through the hall. He raised a hand, and the sound died instantly. His existence was kept from me, but no longer. He is my son, and he is the future of this kingdom. He turned back to Serafina. The queen, my wife, saw this boy not as a miracle, but as a threat. Fearing her position, fearing the irrelevance of a barren queen in a court that values fertility above all else, she conspired to murder him. The murmur returned, louder this time, filled with horror and outrage. The murder of a child, especially a royal child, was the ultimate taboo. She used poison. Dante's voice dropped, becoming a venomous whisper that carried to every corner of the room. She would have watched my son die in agony to protect her own vanity. This I cannot forgive. This the kingdom cannot abide. He raised his voice again, ringing with judgment. I, Dante of House Noctis, hereby dissolve my marriage to Serafina of House Valerus. I strip her of her title, her lands, and her dignities. She is exiled from this court and these lands, effective immediately. If she ever returns, it will be as a traitor, to be executed on sight. Serafina let out a strangled cry, but the guards holding her were unmoved. They began to drag her from the hall, her pleas for mercy echoing and then fading into silence. Dante let the silence settle again before he delivered his final, world-altering decree. He walked to the obsidian throne, the seat of his power, the symbol for which he had sacrificed everything. He ran a hand over its cold, sharp edge. Then he turned to face his court, his people. I have failed this kingdom. Not in matters of state, but in matters of the heart, which are the foundation of all else. My choice 10 years ago was born of fear of instability, fear of breaking with tradition. That fear led me to commit a great injustice. It led my wife to commit a great crime. It has brought shame upon my house and my reign. He took a deep breath. A king who rules from fear is no king at all. And a man who cannot protect his own family is not fit to protect a nation. Therefore, I will no longer be your king. This time, the sound was a collective, disbelieving gasp. The High Council elders looked as if they might faint. I hereby abdicate the throne of the eternal night, Dante declared, his voice ringing with finality. He looked directly at his son. I name as my successor my son, Elias of House Noctis. He will be king. The hall erupted into chaos. Shouts, protests, questions. Dante ignored them all. He held up a hand, and the sheer force of his will slowly quieted the room. He is a child, and he will need guidance. He will need a regent to rule in his name until he comes of age. A regent who will protect him, who will teach him, and who will love him unconditionally. A regent whose only interest is his well-being, not politics or power. His eyes found Zara. He was speaking to her now, and to the entire world. I name as his regent, his mother, the Lady Zara. He unclasped the heavy iron crown from his head. He held it for a moment, feeling its familiar, terrible weight. Then, he walked down the steps of the dais, through the stunned and parting sea of his courtiers, until he stood before his son and the woman he had wronged. He did not place the crown on Elias's head. The boy was too young, the burden too great. Instead, he held it out to Zara. It is yours to hold for him, he said, his voice now stripped of all its royal authority, leaving only the raw, vulnerable tone of a man. Rule in his name. Guide him. Keep him safe. Zara stared at the crown, then at him. Her eyes were wide, filled with 1,000 emotions he could not begin to decipher. Slowly, her hand came up and her fingers brushed against the cold iron. She took it. The weight of the kingdom settled into her hands. Dante stepped back, the absence of the crown making him feel impossibly light. He was no longer a king. He was just Dante. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something that resembled hope. The regent's solar was a world away from the cold, imposing grandeur of the throne hall. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass windows, painted patterns of color on the warm wooden floors. Books overflowed from shelves, and maps were spread across a large oak table. It was Zara's space, and now, it was the new center of power in the kingdom. 2 days had passed since the abdication. The court was still reeling, but a new order was beginning to settle. Regent Zara had already proven to be calm, decisive, and intelligent, meeting with the council and issuing her first decrees with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. Dante had requested this meeting. He had not commanded it. He had sent a note, formally addressed to the regent, and had waited for her summons. He stood before her now, feeling like the petitioner he had once made her be. Elias was not present. This was a conversation for them alone. Zara sat behind the large desk, the iron crown resting on a velvet cushion to her side. She did not look at him, her attention focused on a document in her hands. The silence was her weapon now, and she wielded it with masterful precision. He remembered a time when he had used silence to command a room. She used it to dismantle a man. Finally, she set the paper down and lifted her eyes to his. They were clear, calm, and utterly unreadable. "You wished to see me?" Her tone was formal, the voice of a ruler addressing a subject. "Yes," he said, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. He had rehearsed this 100 times in his mind, but the words still felt clumsy, inadequate. "Zara, he stopped. There was no title he could use. Lady Zara felt too distant, regent too formal. Her name, spoken plainly, felt too intimate. He started again. "I did not do what I did to win your favor. I did it because it was the only thing left to do. It was the only way to ensure Elias was safe, to right the monumental wrong I set in motion 10 years ago." She said nothing, her gaze unwavering. She was waiting. She was making him say it all. "I know what I destroyed," he said, the words tearing from a place deep inside him. "I know what I cost us. I cost you. I don't expect you to forget that. I don't expect you to forgive it. Forgiveness is a gift, and I have done nothing to earn it." He took a step closer to the desk, his hands open at his sides in a gesture of supplication. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not asking to be your mate, or your husband, or your king. I gave up the right to ask for anything from you a long time ago." His voice dropped, becoming thick with the weight of his unshed grief for the life they never had. "I am asking for a chance. A chance to be in my son's life. Not as a king, not as a figure of power, but as his father. I want to teach him to wield a sword. I want to read the histories with him. I want to be there to see him grow into the king he will one day become. And I want to be there for you, not as a ruler, but as a support. An advisor. A guard. Whatever you need. I will serve you and our son in any capacity you see fit." He finally ran out of words. He had laid himself bare. He had offered up the broken pieces of himself with no expectation that she would accept them. He had surrendered all his power, first his crown, and now his pride. He stood before her, waiting for her judgment. Zara was silent for a long time. She looked from his face to the crown, then back again. He saw a flicker of the girl she had been, the one with the hopeful eyes in the palace garden, before it was subsumed by the strength of the woman she had become. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it held the unyielding strength of bedrock. "You speak of earning things," she said. "You are right. You have earned nothing. Not yet." She rose from her chair and walked around the desk until she stood directly in front of him. She was close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender and parchment that always clung to her. She was close enough that he could have reached out and touched her, but he wouldn't have dared. The space between them was sacred, and it was hers to control. "You want a chance," she said, her dark eyes searching his. "A chance is not a gift. It is a debt. You will pay it every day. You will not be given a place in his life. You will earn it. You will earn every moment, every conversation, every shared smile. You will prove, with your actions, not your words, that you are the man you claim you want to be, and not the king you were." She paused, and her next words were the ones that would define the rest of his life. "I will not keep you from your son. But his trust, and mine, is not something you can claim. It must be won. Slowly. Patiently. Do you understand?" Relief, so potent it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him. It wasn't a yes. It was a crucible. It was a long, arduous road with no guarantee of a destination. But it was a road. It was a path forward where he had believed there was only a wall of his own making. "I understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said, her expression softening for the first time, a flicker of something that looked like pained empathy in her eyes. "I am doing this for Elias. He deserves a father. I only hope you can learn how to be 1 inch." She turned and walked back to her desk, picking up the document as if their conversation, the one that had just reshaped his entire existence, was concluded. It was a dismissal, but it was not a rejection. It was the first day of his penance. And the first day of his hope. He gave a small, formal bow to the regent of his kingdom, the mother of his son, and left her solar with the weight of her challenge settling upon his shoulders. It was a heavier burden than the crown had ever been, and he was grateful to bear it. The days that followed bled into weeks, the weeks into months. Life in the Obsidian Spire found a new rhythm, one dictated not by the rigid ceremony of Dante's reign, but by the quiet, steady hand of the regent Zara. She ruled with a pragmatism and empathy the court had never known. She listened to petitioners, she reviewed trade agreements, she walked the castle grounds and spoke with the staff, learning the inner workings of the kingdom from the ground up. And Dante learned a new way to live. He was no longer the king. He was simply Lord Dante, a man with no official title and no duties save those the regent assigned him. At first, there were none. He was a ghost in the palace he had once commanded, his presence a constant, silent question. He kept his word. He did not push, did not demand. He made himself available. He would spend his mornings in the training yard, practicing his forms with a discipline that bordered on obsession. He would spend his afternoons in the royal library, reading the histories and political treatises he had never had time for as king. He made sure his path would cross with Elias's, but he never forced an interaction. The first breakthrough came a month into his new life. Elias, who had been watching him from the library's upper gallery, came down to the training yard. The boy held a wooden practice sword that was too large for him. "My tutor says I'm not holding it right," Elias said, without preamble. "He says my balance is wrong." Dante's heart gave a painful lurch. He carefully put his own sword aside and turned to his son. "May I see?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elias demonstrated the clumsy stance his tutor had taught him. Dante watched, then nodded. "Your tutor is teaching you the standard form for a royal guard," he explained. "It is designed for a grown man's height and weight. But your center of gravity is lower. You need a different stance. One that uses your size as an advantage, not a weakness." He spent the next hour adjusting the boy's feet, showing him how to hold his shoulders, how to use his hips to generate power. He was patient, his instructions clear and encouraging. He did not talk down to him. By the end of the lesson, Elias was moving with a newfound confidence, the wooden sword no longer an awkward burden but an extension of his arm. "Thank you," Elias said, his face bright with sweat and pride. "The honor was mine," Dante replied, his voice thick with emotion. He glanced up and saw Zara standing in the archway of the yard. She had been watching them. Her expression was unreadable, but she did not intervene. She simply watched for a moment, then turned and walked away. It was a test, and he felt he had, perhaps, passed the first part of it. The sword lessons became a daily ritual. From there, other small moments began to accumulate, like stones building a foundation. Elias would seek him out in the library to ask about a passage in a history book. Dante would explain the political context of a treaty or the strategy of a famous battle, drawing maps on scraps of parchment to illustrate his points. They discovered a shared love for a particular type of sweet cake served by the kitchens, and would sometimes share one in companionable silence. Dante never overstepped. He never presumed to discipline Elias, never contradicted Zara's instructions to him. He was a supplementary presence, a source of knowledge and companionship. He was earning his place, moment by moment. His relationship with Zara remained one of careful, respectful distance. He would attend council meetings at her request, sitting not at the head of the table but in a simple chair against the wall. When she asked for his opinion, he gave it quietly, logically, always deferring to her final judgment. He was her advisor, her most loyal subject. He learned her rhythms, the way she worried her lower lip when she was deep in thought, the way she preferred tea over wine when she worked late into the night. One evening, he found her in the solar, asleep at her desk, her head pillowed on a stack of trade ledgers. A half-empty cup of tea had gone cold beside her. For a long moment, he just watched her, the moonlight from the window tracing the lines of her face. She looked exhausted, the weight of the kingdom heavy even on her capable shoulders. He felt a surge of protective tenderness so fierce it almost buckled his knees. He gently removed the cup and papers from under her arm, then retrieved a thick woolen blanket from a nearby chest. He draped it carefully over her shoulders, his fingers brushing against her hair. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, and settled deeper into the chair. He stood there for a long time, just watching her breathe, the ghost of their bond humming faintly in the quiet room. He had not earned the right to wake her, to tell her to go to bed. He had only earned the right to keep her warm. He extinguished all but one of the lamps and left her to her rest. The next morning, when he saw her at a council meeting, she looked refreshed. She met his eyes across the table and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement. A thank you. It was more precious to him than any jewel. The stones of their foundation were settling, becoming stronger. He was learning that fatherhood, and perhaps love itself, was not about grand gestures, but about the quiet accumulation of small, selfless acts. It was about offering a blanket in the middle of the night and asking for nothing in return. 2 years passed. 2 years of sword lessons, of shared books, of quiet council meetings. 2 years of Dante earning his place, one day at a time. The court had settled into its new reality. The boy king, Elias, was beloved, a bright, kind, and thoughtful child who was growing into his future role under the wise guidance of his mother, the regent, and the quiet tutelage of his father, the former king. The kingdom was prospering. Zara's pragmatic and compassionate rule had smoothed over old rivalries and opened new avenues of trade. The family they were becoming was a strange and fragile thing, built not on tradition or law, but on 1,000 small, earned moments. Dante was no longer just a tutor or an advisor. He was a fixture in Elias's life. He was father. The first time Elias had called him that, a simple, unthinking utterance during a sparring match, Dante had frozen, his heart seizing in his chest. He had looked at Zara, who was watching from the sidelines, and had seen a faint, sad smile on her lips. It was an acknowledgement of a truth that could no longer be denied. The distance between Dante and Zara had lessened, the careful formality replaced by a comfortable, if quiet, partnership. They were co-parents, allies in the monumental task of raising a king. They would often sit together in the solar late at night, after Elias was asleep, discussing matters of state or simply sharing a companionable silence. The chasm of pain and betrayal was still there, a deep ravine carved by their shared history, but they had built a sturdy bridge of devotion to their son across it. One night, Dante found Zara on the high balcony overlooking the capital, the same one from which he had once watched her and Elias from afar. The moon was a perfect silver sickle in the ink-black sky. She was staring out at the sleeping city, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the night's chill. He came to stand beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long time, they said nothing, simply sharing the view. He asked me about it today, Zara said, her voice soft, almost carried away by the breeze. About the bond. About us. Dante's breath caught. What did you tell him? The truth, she replied. That the bond chose us, but we had to choose it back. And that you made a different choice. A choice you thought was right for your kingdom. She turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes luminous in the moonlight. I told him that choices, once made, have consequences that can last a lifetime. But I also told him that people can make new choices. Better ones. The unspoken meaning hung in the air between them. You are making better choices now. Zara, he began, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken regret and 2 years of burgeoning hope. Everything I did. I know it is not enough to erase the past. But I hope, he trailed off, not knowing how to finish. She saved him from having to. She closed the small distance between them and, for the first time in 12 years, she reached out and touched him. Her fingers rested lightly on his forearm, a simple, hesitant gesture that held more weight than any royal decree. Her touch was not fiery or passionate, as it had once been. It was warm, steady, and real. The past doesn't need to be erased, Dante, she said quietly. It just needs to be outweighed. By the present. By the future. She looked toward Elias's window, where a single lamp still burned. He is happy. He is safe. He is loved. That is the only thing that matters. He looked down at her hand on his arm. It was an anchor in the storm of his past. It was a promise of a calm harbor ahead. He slowly, carefully, covered her hand with his own. She did not pull away. The contact was a quiet consummation, not of a rekindled romance, but of a partnership forged in fire and loss, and tempered by patience and love for their child. "He has your strength," Dante murmured, his gaze following hers to their son's window. A small smile touched Zara's lips. "And he has your stubbornness," she countered gently. "And your heart, I think. The one you tried so hard to hide." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand under the silver moon, no longer a king and his rejected mate, but a man and a woman who had lost everything and had, against all odds, found their way back. Not to what they were, but to something new. Something stronger. Something earned. They were a family, scarred and imperfect, but a family nonetheless, built not on the whims of fate,